Good evening, everybody. Allow me to introduce myself initially. My name is Donald Wise, and I am the current president of the UCD Engineering Graduates Association. On behalf of the UCD Engineering Graduates Association and our sponsors, I would like to welcome you to the 2021 Annual Spring Panel Discussion. The topic of the discussion this year, as you know, is applying inclusive design methods to engineering. A very distinguished panel has been assembled, and we look forward to a very interesting and informative discussion. Before we commence, I would like to point out that closed captioning is available thanks to Premier Captioning and Real-Time Limited for the presentation today. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see a box labeled CC. If you click on this, you will be able to turn on closed captioning for the presentation. Our moderator for this evening is Professor Elizabeth Goodman of UCD. So I will now hand you over to Elizabeth, who will chair the evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it's lovely to be here with all of you, especially to discuss one of my very favorite topics, which is inclusive design, or inclusive by design, as we've titled this seminar. So I have the great honor of introducing three excellent speakers, and then I'll moderate some discussion and question and answers after their presentations. So I'll introduce the three speakers together and then individually for their talks. We have Professor Jutta Treviranus, who is the founder director of the Inclusive Design Research Center and Inclusive Design Institute, and full professor at the Ontario College of Art and Design University in Toronto, Canada. We have Professor Sambari Chandrasekhar, who is Inclusive Design Lead at Brightspace and Desire to Learn, Canada visiting faculty at OCADU Toronto, and former academic supervisor on the Masters of Inclusive Design at OCADU. And we have Mr. Damian Owens, Registrar of Engineers Ireland. So it's going to be a great event. Sit back and enjoy it. And firstly, we invite Professor Jutta Treviranus to give her presentation.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I'm just going to share my screen and I'm hoping that what you're seeing is the correct view.
Yes.
Great. And thank you so much for this opportunity to talk to the engineers and specifically talk about the issues with deciding, measuring, and planning in the current times. One of the things that we've come to understand collectively is that we live in a complex adaptive system in accelerating flux. It's entangled and complexly connected. It's rife with feedback loops. It's viral. It's not just complicated, and therefore not amenable to traditional engineering techniques. I've long been teaching that diversity is our greatest asset and inclusion is our greatest challenge. But certainly this pandemic has added the admonition that none of us are safe until all of us are safe, which compel us to use more inclusive engineering methods. But traditional means of deciding, judging, and planning no longer work. And added to that is the complication that everything important is now digitally mediated, so that even traditional universal design strategies do not work. We've learned that accessibility must be proactive. Digital systems cannot be retrofit. Accessibility and inclusion must be built in from the foundation. And separate assistive technologies for digital access cannot be kept interoperable and cost more, adding to economic disparity. Barriers will morph, propagate once adopted, and cannot be contained. And what we know is that if we don't design inclusively from the start, then laws are a necessary evil. But the issue with laws is they are a blunt instrument for complexity and put the burden of compromise on a group that faces constraints to adaptation. We also have learned that inclusion means full participation. It isn't the case of an engineer solving a problem for a group. The design has to happen with, and we need representation of the barriers or lived experience of the barriers among the engineers. And one insight of complexity theory is that we are currently stuck on a local optima. If we look at the current situation as a complex terrain, we are hill climbing, optimizing the patterns of the past and eroding the slope and thereby increasing disparity in the process. And to find our way out of this and out of the next crisis, we need to reach the global optima. To do this, we need to include people that are out at that outer edge, who have a better view of the whole terrain, are more diverse, and are not investing in failing strategies. And one of the current strategies, or many of the current strategies, are prone to cobra effects, or the unintended consequences of oversimplistic solution to complex problems, linear thinking, not considering the complex adaptive system we live in. In my applied research over the past 40 years, I've collected data on human requirements. If I plot this large data set on a multivariate scatter plot, I get what I've called the human starburst, where 80% of the needs occupy 20% of the space in the middle, and 20% of the needs occupy the remaining 80% of the space. And one important aspect to notice is that the needs in the middle are close together, meaning they're very similar, and the needs as you move away from the middle are far apart, meaning they're very different. And because of majority decision-making and economies of scale, what we find is that design works for those 80% in the middle becomes more difficult as you move away from the middle, and doesn't work as you reach that outer edge. And from the perspective of statistical determination that we use in our research, it is highly accurate for the middle, inaccurate as you move away from the middle, and wrong as you reach the edge. And this phenomenon trickles through all of our systems, whether it's design due to Pareto 80-20 rule, where the individuals out at the outer edge are considered the difficult 20%, or whether it's our products due to Moore's law, especially within the digital domain, where availability, reliability, functionality, and cost is increasing for everyone, but getting worse for those individuals at the edge. Knowledge, which depends on statistical significance and homogeneity, and results in ignoring that edge, not recognizing it, not understanding it. Education, where we are working on conformity to standards as opposed to diversification of knowledge. Work, where we are aiming for replaceable workers. And democracy, or the reduced form of democracy, where majority rules as opposed to a more nuanced and advanced form of democracy. And this leads to negative effects, not just for those individuals out at the edge, but for the majority, because what we do is we consider humans as a mass, and we thereby sacrifice true innovation. An enlightened self-interest will tell you that we will land in that outer edge. We will all land there. It is the universal human condition. Classificatory strategies, which are used in many equity and accessibility strategies, cause those unintended consequences as well, because if an individual doesn't belong to a classificatory group or is stranded out at the outer edge, it becomes even more difficult to be included in the design. This doesn't just harm people at the margins, as I've said, but all of us, because out at the outer edge is where we find innovation and weak signals. Designing with the edge leaves room for change and growth for the majority. But we need to abandon our linear logic models that are part of standard engineering practice, those PERT charts, those Gantt charts. To stretch out to the edge, we need to employ an iterative processes that continuously ask who is missing and stretch our systems, designing adaptable systems that will stretch out to that outer edge. Unlike design thinking, which iteratively arrives at a winning solution, inclusive design creates a system that can adapt to encompass the needs at the margins. And of course, the immediate question you might ask is, what about cost? Doesn't it cost more to consider that full diversity of requirements right from the beginning? But what we've learned is that planning with the edge saves costs because our system is more adaptable, less brittle, and more prepared for the crisis to come. And I'd love to continue the conversation, and I will turn it back over to Lisbeth now.
Thanks, Yuta, so much. I am always inspired by your words, and I'm sure we'll have questions and an opportunity to follow up. So thank you, Yuta. Next, we go to Professor Sambari Chandrasekhar. Welcome, Sam, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Liz. So, is everyone able to hear me and see my slides?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so good evening, and thank you for inviting me. Ubuntu stands for I cannot be happy using something so long as someone else is unable to use it. And inclusive design is about caring for everyone. It is about being mindful of who would be using the things we make and how they would be using them. We must make a deliberate attempt to include, because inclusive design is inclusion by design, like Liz was saying. So what's the idea? A simple idea we can carry in our heads is inclusion equals diversity plus equity plus awareness. When we design products, we need to be aware of the different needs of our diverse users and include the users with extreme needs on the edges into our design process. You just spoke about inclusive design, and I will talk about how to recognize exclusion so we're able to practice inclusive design better. Inclusive design is design that considers the full range of human diversity with respect to ability, language, culture, gender, age, and other forms of human difference. When we don't include intentionally, we end up excluding unintentionally. As engineers, I'm sure you are process-oriented and will be fascinated to hear about an exercise that teams could carry out to recognize exclusion. To recognize who we are excluding, we need to first understand the cycle of exclusion. We continue to remain within the cycle of exclusion when we repeat the same behaviors and assume that we have no power to change. We need to recognize and externalize our unconscious biases. We can recognize who we are excluding by examining what's called the cycle of exclusion. The cycle of exclusion is a tool that helps teams examine who's participating in the process of making. It is essentially a set of 5 questions that team members could ask of themselves. What do we make? Why do we make it? How is it made? Who makes it? And who uses it? We'll see each of these separately with examples. So to begin with, what do we make? We make things that we think users need, and we imagine how they will use it. For a long time, game controllers and consoles were operable only using 2 hands. No one realized that people who have only 1 hand or those with motor disabilities would also be interested in playing games, until Microsoft came up with the Xbox Adaptive Controller. Around 7,000 users with disabilities were involved and consulted in the building of that adaptive controller. Now that is an example of true inclusive design. Why do we make it? We usually make what we think users need, especially the average user persona that we create, which actually doesn't exist. There's nothing like an average. Or we build what our institution mandates us to do. We must try to see what the users in the edges actually need. For example, when Kodak, the photography company, put out a technology to make their digital pictures appear better, they used a model with white skin all through to teach the machine learning system. As a result, people with dark skin could never get their pictures to look good until Kodak invented a technology to make pictures of chocolates look good. Believe me, that's a true story. So that all boils down to how do we make it? We know that designing for people instead of with people could lead to exclusion. But if we bring people in, do we have the inclusive tools to include them? For example, if a user who's blind is included in a prototype testing, is the prototype itself accessible to screen readers? Does the research protocol respect the needs of a person who's blind? If the answer to any of these questions is no, you can spot exclusion there. And who makes it? Most design teams are homogeneous and lack diversity of views. They have biases, assumptions about who uses their designs. Such design choices increase mismatch. For example, the team who designed automatic taps operating in airports in the USA used a motion detector technology that was built to recognize white skin. As a result, again, believe me, when Black people put their hand under the tap, water wouldn't flow. Inclusion is a mindset that we need to develop by including people with different contexts of use, as well as different mindsets into our teams. Finally, who uses it? Whatever we make. Obviously, only those who were included in the designer's assumptions and biases, and therefore included in the input phase. These may not be users who actually need the product or service. Users who are excluded in the research phase are excluded from design and from use. It is important to start inclusion at the input gathering phase. So how do we break the cycle of exclusion? It's not easy, but inclusive design requires us to try our best. Because when people get excluded by design, they feel rejected. They feel like they don't belong. But the good news is that exclusion habits can be changed. Bryce Johnson, co-inventor of the Xbox adaptive game controller, introduced the term exclusion experts for people who commonly get excluded. They get excluded so much that they become an expert on the topic. And to break the cycle of exclusion, we need to include exclusion experts in the design process and always believe that we have the power to change the status quo. We can raise a voice against people who say, we've always done it that way in our company. But there's a cautionary note. Learning inclusion is like learning a new language. It takes time and practice, and it can be slow at first. Inclusive design could also seem like incomplete design to some people because we keep iterating the design with more and more users. So Utah's favorite wabi-sabi principles come in handy here. The three principles are: nothing is perfect, nothing is finished, and nothing lasts. This is a great philosophy for life, I would say, and I live by it. Finally, I want to leave some resources. You can take the implicit bias test online and check your blind areas. And there are Utah's 3 articles. They are a must read to understand inclusive design. And there's a video by Kat Holmes explaining cycle of exclusion. And there's another video about how design can exclude. With that, I will conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam. Brilliant as always. And I always feel better knowing that Sam is in charge of accessibility at Brightspace, Desire to Learn. Now that so many universities, including UCD, use it, it makes me feel much better. We're on a positive trajectory. So our third speaker, adding another dimension to the conversation, we welcome Mr. Damian Owens, the Registrar of Engineers Ireland. So the floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you. So hopefully that's coming up on screen.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay. So good evening. I suppose for the next 5 minutes or so, what I want to try and cover is how do we educate the next generation of engineers in inclusive design methods? How do we get that knowledge to percolate into the workforce? In particular, in a situation where technology processes, everything's changing so rapidly. How do we keep up? So if you look at engineering education, it's there's an academic formation phase, which is education assessment. Then once the graduate goes into the workforce, real world application, then there's a virtuous circle there where there's assessment by engineering peers, say to become a chartered engineer. And it's I suppose a system that allows for refinement and continuing development of engineering education throughout the entire career, the continuing professional development. In the engineering programs that are delivered in universities, they are accredited every 5 years by Engineers Ireland, and there are a number of learning outcomes that we look for. One here, for example, we'll look at ethical responsibilities. So that engineers, when they're designing anything, would understand and appreciate the environmental, social, and economic impacts of what they're doing, know of their role within society. And then from a design perspective, be able to deal with a whole range of problems, ill-defined problems, how do we design innovative solutions for novel systems. So these are all part of the learning process that we assess students for. And here we have teamwork and lifelong learning. So we look to see that students, engineering students, are getting exposed to work in multidisciplinary settings, not just with other engineering students. They could work with a law student or a psychology student on a project or a community project or a workspace project. So, and problem-based learning, using real-world problems to tackle some of the, I suppose, the issues that we've been discussing so far. And it's not just done in a vacuum. Engineering is a global career. And a global profession. So the learning outcomes that we are looking at are agreed on a global basis among a number of engineering education accreditation organizations. And really the point of accreditation is to provide trust and confidence, but it's based on outcomes. So we are assessing what the student has demonstrated and learned during that program. And the public trust engineers, and the important aspect of this is that they trust engineers to do the right thing, to design the right product, to design the right service, so that it is fit for purpose, will not fail, will not harm. This is a survey we conducted a couple of years ago from the public, about 1,500 respondents. And you can see that engineers are very near the top in terms of being trusted by the public as A, highly competent, and B, would tell the truth. And you can see we just got pipped at the post by doctors, but teachers, judges are fairly highly regarded, and then you can go down through the rest of the professions and form your own judgment as to who's the more trusted and competent. We then undertook some surveys across between academia and industry, just to get different views on our learning outcomes as to what is industry value and what is academia value, and there's very close alignment. So I think everybody's on the same page in terms of understanding what we need to teach engineers and what the engineers in the workforce need to be capable of doing. And looking at a broader perspective, we looked at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and there we saw a little bit of divergence. We see in the workplace, in the industry respondents, placed, I suppose, more emphasis on say gender equality, good health, well-being, partnerships, working towards economic growth. So there's no poverty. So that was a surprise to us, and that it covered a lot of the I suppose the softer issues and the issues that would lead to more inclusivity. So we can see that the industrial respondents there, let's say, if I want to use the phrase, are living in that world at the edge where they're dealing with these boundary conditions, I suppose, day in, day out, and they're designing products and services to address those real needs. So if we look at some of the resources that are available, particularly as engineers leave or graduates leave education and move into the workforce, well, there's universal design, which is looking at designing for to cater for the most number of users, and the National Disability Authority have a whole suite of support tools there in their universal design website, and they provide a number of competitions for third level students to design inclusive designs for be it houses or products of any description. They have a competition every year on that, and that's supported by government agencies such as Enterprise Ireland. They also have produced a range of, there is an Irish and EU standard in this area looking at accessibility, and they have a YouTube channel with the normals on it. So that's a family, and you can look and see how they cope with everyday situations. Another development, moving then from universal design into, as Jutta had said earlier, I suppose the edges, dealing with the edges. This is an initiative by the National Council for the Blind in Ireland called the Wayfinding Campus. It's only just in the design stage, but will be operational next year. And the point here is to provide a range of, I suppose, real street situations using a real tram, a real bus, a real train, street furniture, and a whole, I suppose, street environment. And it's not just for the users, and this is a very important point. It's not just for the users of these facilities, it's for the designers as well. So they want the engineers, the ethnographers, psychologists to come in and refine their offerings for the public, for all the public as part of that design work. And again, to echo a point made earlier, you know, it is extra time spent during the design phase, but it's time well spent. And in the long run, it will save a lot of effort and a lot of wasted energy and cost later on. So thank you for that, and we'll take questions shortly.
Thank you so much. Another excellent presentation. That's fantastic, Damian. Really informative. Okay, so we're going to move to our question phase. I've got a few brief questions for each of the three speakers, and then we'll try to move into a conversation with the audience as well. So first, I wanted to ask, because this point has been raised several times, but just so we're crystal clear, I'm going to ask Jutta, what is the difference between inclusive design and universal design?
Right. Thank you for that question. And in fact, in terms of the more general conception of universal design, the two are very similar. But what we have, universal design comes out of the fields of architecture and industrial design, and prior to digital design. And therefore, the standard strategy within universal design is to come up with a one-size-fits-all design that encompasses the greatest number of individuals. Inclusive design, because certainly, or there are actually two sort of practices of inclusive design, but the inclusive design that we developed since '93 here in Canada it grew up out of the digital, and the digital allows for greater affordances, and you don't need to come up with a single doorway design. You can come up with a system that presents to each user a one-size-fits-one opportunity, or a range of choices, recognizing diversity, because the understanding that we have of certainly of disability or many of the excluded groups is that they're highly, highly diverse, and often their ability to adapt to a particular constraint or compromise is also compromised. And so for a group of individuals that is more diverse than the average, to think that we can have a single design that works for everyone is at issue. The other difference is that often we think of universal design as applying largely to people with disabilities, but in fact, disability itself is something that is a quickly changing and variable state. And all of us can experience barriers. And so the design that addresses the needs of people with disabilities will frequently also address the other barriers that people experience due to attitude, due to specific design methods. So inclusive design encompasses the full range of human difference. Just because I mentioned the two forms of inclusive design, there is also a very wonderful school of inclusive design that grew up out of the UK. It differs from our philosophy in that it is based on the goal of creating a doable or reasonable form of universal design by determining what is the high incidence disability and how much more of the general customer base will you reach given the addressing specific barriers. We take a different approach in that we say what you should do is try to reach the margins of the scatter plot, the very edges, as opposed to determining these groupings of high incidence disability. We also don't try to find a static solution. As Sam quoted, we use the wabi-sabi principle because the world changes, people are variable. And so rather than trying to find one winning solution through a competitive process, we recognize that inclusive design requires ongoing vigilance and continuously asking who is missing, creating a system that stretches out to that outer edge. And that's how it differs from the standard sort of design thinking processes as well.
Thank you, Yuta. And can I do a tiny little follow-up? You already mentioned this, but just again to be crystal clear so that our audience, so that we have a shared vocabulary. Oh, there you are. I thought it was a bandwidth issue from Toronto.
It is.
It's great to see you for a moment. Anyway, can I also ask just quickly, how does inclusive design then differ from accessibility?
So the way that it's usually characterized is accessibility is a set of criteria that need to be addressed in order to address the needs of people with disabilities. So it's a testable set of criteria. It differs from inclusive design in that inclusive design is the process. So the process of designing in such a way that we address the full range of human difference.
Brilliant. Thank you, Yuta. That's hugely helpful. And so I want to launch from there, if you'll allow me, into a question for Sam that kind of follows on. So Sam, as a practitioner of inclusive design in a commercial entity or setup, can you explain how the process works in your company? Oh, you're muted, Sam.
Yes, I discovered that. Thank you. At D2L, we practice inclusive design. I must say, we proudly practice inclusive design. We believe that accessibility is a byproduct of our inclusive design process, and it's not just a checkbox for regulatory purposes. Having worked with Yuta since 2005, I wanted to slip that in somehow or the other. I carried all that passion and knowledge with me to D2L when I joined them as accessibility program manager in 2017. But I also consider myself privileged because the senior leadership in D2L is fully supportive of inclusion and accessibility. And when I joined D2L, the design and engineering departments were already building and using design patterns and reusable web components, which had the WCAG accessibility criteria built into them. Further, since I think 2011, D2L has also had a blind screen reader expert as a member of the accessibility team. So all I had to do was to help scale that up to include more types of disabilities and also move the whole process towards the left. So now inclusive design starts at the research phase at D2L. We include people with disabilities in our strategic and exploratory research studies. More than 6% of our participants use some form of assistive technology. And our products are based on our research and our exploratory design explorations, I should say. Our design explorations are mindful about catering to the needs of users with different disabilities, and they specify most of the accessibility criteria, and the engineers need to implement these while coding. Our teams have accessibility criteria built into the what is called as the definition of done, and features are not released until all criteria are met. We partner with a company called FableTech Labs. This company offers a cloud-based solution through which we get to meet accessibility consultants and testers using a variety of assistive technologies. And we get to work with them remotely through Zoom for consultation for accessibility testing. In a month, at least, we test 5 times or consult 5 times through that. And we also have a number of clients who support people with disabilities, such as Thomas Pocklington Trust in the UK, CNIB in Canada, Vision Australia, International Disability Alliance, whose feedback helps us to improve the inclusivity of our projects or products. So I think I should stop here, otherwise I'll keep going. So
that's great. And just a quick follow-up. So concretely for the engineers in our audience and in our group, in your context then, in your industry, what would be the role of engineers in a product process that practices inclusive design?
I could talk about what we do. So our engineers get to learn about accessibility during their onboarding process. We make sure that they are aware, and then they are exposed to develop empathy. We don't actually train them how to code. We just train them about the importance of coding because they are experts in their field. They know how to go and get the actual way of implementing it. There are training programs and references or resources available. Even within the engineering group, there are several experts. They mentor the new engineers. Specifically, most of the assignment accessibility requirements are specified by our designers in the specs, like alt text for icons and any other non-text elements, headings, regions, landmarks, alerts. There are so many. Everything is specified by the designers like a recipe, and engineers translate all that very efficiently into their code. And there are tools like Acts by DQ that are built into the processes, such as unit testing, integration testing, etc. Like, we are a software company. Engineers also test through FableTech Labs. There are technically savvy people who are disabled people in the FableTech Labs community. So even consultation regarding engineering problems is possible. And we also have a community of practice called the Accessibility Llamas. It's comprised of engineers and designers, and they keep on top of what's latest and onboarding and training and all that. Yeah.
That's brilliant. Thanks for the example, Sam. So now I want to move back to Damian and kind of ground all these ideas back in Ireland for a moment, and in the engineering community with the wisdom of Engineers Ireland. So Damian, pardon me, it's a slightly long question, but then I'll be quiet and we want to hear it. So the question is, the concept of universal design has been around in Ireland for some years and has crept into teaching and training to some degree, whereas the concept of inclusive design is newer and still not often taught here in Ireland, except in some PhD training. It's important to remember the distinctions between the two, as we've been discussing for the past half hour. But given all that, Damian, how do you see the field of inclusive design filtering into the domain of jobs for the future of engineering graduates here in Ireland?
That's a big one. I suppose if you look at inclusive design, it's bringing as many entities into the design process as possible, as early as possible. And I think certainly in the engineering education phase, okay, at PhD level is one, but also I think at undergraduate level, many more students, nearly all of the engineering programs now have work placements, and we're exposing students to the industrial processes, so they get a much earlier visibility of processes and a greater awareness of why they're designing things and how to make them better. So I think there's a cycle there that's helping. Students have been exposed to a lot more problem-based learning at university level. So they're not just doing engineering projects, they're doing a project, say, with the law school or with psychology school or whatever. So they're being exposed to multidisciplinary settings with other undergraduates. Moving that into the workplace, over time, the graduates will go into the workplace, and you will get by osmosis, you'll get learning into the workplace. But also, engineers, like other professions, have a requirement for continuing professional development, so they should be keeping up with that. And organisations like Engineers Ireland and professional bodies have a duty to inform their members of new trends. So that's another aspect of it. One thing we've seen, because of a positive of the pandemic, if there is such a thing, is because of the move to largely online delivery of engineering programs. A lot more employers are expressing an interest just to take one module from a course, maybe an 8-hour module on design. It could be inclusive design or wherever the topic is, and it's easy for the college to deliver that to industry and make a few dollars out of it. But also, we're also seeing the emergence of micro-credentials in the academic community. And I think that is another way of, by getting the expertise out there again by osmosis.
Brilliant, thanks so much. And there's really interesting material there. I think we could have a conversation, but just first, Damian, to tie it down even further, why, in your view, is it important for engineering graduates to be aware of the process of becoming more inclusive by design?
I think it was touched on earlier in the earlier presentations. One big thing is, reduce waste. We've had the phrase from years ago, get it right first time. It's a very laudable thing, but it's very difficult to do. But I think if the effort put in at the start of the design phase, I think effort put in there pays multiple in terms of the bounty coming out later. And if you look at something that's topical at the moment, is the rollout of the vaccine programs for COVID. Okay, now in Germany they've rolled out their scheme, and they designed so they know that if Joe applies for his vaccine, then it's Joe that's getting it. So how did you do that? You put in an online system where you log in. There's two-stage authentication. You get a password and a PIN number, and you put in your details, answer a questionnaire, and fill in a few forms. Okay, and that all sounds really good, except the people you're trying to reach for the first stage of the rollout are the over 80s. There's 5.4 million people over 80 years of age in Germany. Okay. And I can tell you, very few of them have email addresses, iPads, are familiar with two-stage authentication. Okay, so the system is ground to a halt because the target market cannot access the tools they need. They don't know how to use them. The net result of that is they're using their children, who are probably in their 50s and 60s, and maybe not too tech savvy either. So the children are calling call centers to get appointments for the vaccination. So the whole system is ground to halt simply because it's well designed, or is it? Technically it's an elegant technical solution. It's secure, but you need more than that. You've got to be aware of the audience and who the users are.
Okay, thanks very much, Damian. There's some questions in the Q&A section, which I see some of our panelists are answering, but just to get a conversation going first, I want to make an observation, certainly in my own experience over decades in inclusive design, working with women and marginalized communities of all kinds, as well as people with disabilities. There's been, almost like in the open source movement, there's been a long period where a few luminaries like Yuta, etc., Sam, would be pushing a new way of working, but certain amount of resistance for a while, and then suddenly the wind comes behind your back. It happened with open source, it happened with many other things, and it feels like now is the moment for inclusive design, that there's a global understanding of the shift from a universal design method forward. Companies like Microsoft, and Cassandra Collins is here representing inclusive design for Microsoft, have changed from their user experience terminology to inclusive design. Cassandra might want to speak to that. So, but to the panelists, first of all, Do you agree, or am I deluded? Is this the moment when inclusive design can fly forward in all of the engineering domains, and can we integrate it more firmly and more effectively into all of our curriculum at all levels? Over to you all.
Yeah, can I, I'll just, and then one worry I have is that hopefully it isn't just a current trend during the pandemic. We are in areas such as artificial intelligence, we have a current buzz in terms of AI ethics. And certainly Sam mentioned some of the risks that have happened there. But the strategies that are being developed to address the AI ethics issues are not encompassing the full range of individuals that are excluded. We are using, for example, the test at the moment is to create these bounded identity groups or protected groups and to compare the performance of a learning model with that group of individuals and the majority. And then if there is a difference, then we determine that there's a bias and something needs to be done. Or the other approach is to find data gaps and to address those data gaps. But in order to actually reach the full range of human difference, we need to think more fundamentally about our planning strategies. They even go as far as question the statistical decision making that we are using. So it reaches well beyond some of the strategies that we've determined are needed. So I'm hoping that there won't be these surface solutions that seem to address the urgent issues of inclusive design, but that it will be a much more fulsome long-term re-looking at what are the strategies that we're using that are causing disparity and that are leaving people out, which of course are connected with many of the other complex crises that we're facing.
Thanks, Jutta. Thanks so much. Did anyone want to come in on that point?
I think I would just add that certainly if you look at the emergence, in particular, of the heavy tech companies in recent years, so we all know them by big names in terms of the large stock market ones, but some of them have got into a lot of deep trouble by, I suppose, being too technically focused and not taking in the human perspective of the services they offer. And I think there's been a report that many of the tech companies now are starting to hire a much more humanities graduates just to give a better rounded profile to their staff. It's okay, one thing starting off as a tech company, but you have to, I think, grow into a more rounded company, and that will address hopefully some of the inherent biases that will be there with a purely technical mind. And it's the same for any group. You do need a more rounded approach.
Thanks, Damian. Sam, did you want to comment on that?
Liz, I'm very busy typing.
typing a novel to a question. Okay, let me throw in another question then while you're typing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. No, I'm not. No, for this one. Sorry.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah, I pass.
Keep going there. Keep going there. I mean, I do wonder sometimes whether our approaches to inclusive design, how we can better integrate. I feel sometimes like all of us who are inclusive design advocates become almost what Sam termed as, exclusion experts, that as you begin to integrate a new concept or a new philosophy and phenomenology into a field like engineering, there's a phase of, does this really fit here? Can we really add this to a course? Is this really relevant to this module or program? And then over time, of course, like design thinking took off and future foresighting and many other methods. But I firmly believe and have experienced inclusive design as a much more substantial phenomenon, not just a methodology, a philosophy that goes much more fundamentally to the core of who are we as people on planet Earth right now. And if we're going to solve problems, well, are we going to solve all problems for all people, or just for those in the West with enough money and two hands that move, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm kind of caricaturing to an extent, but I wonder how can we make sure that advocates of inclusive design, but also of any novel way of thinking or any new philosophical framing of an academic domain and of a lifestyle, don't themselves get labeled as exclusion experts or treated as such, because there's a shift of population and a shift of ideas, and often it's difficult to let go of the paradigm that's got you somewhere or that's underpinning your courses or whatever. So it's a really exciting time, but it's also a time when there's some I don't know, some nuanced dancing to be done. I suspect. Any comments on that?
I agree. I think one of the, certainly if we talk about academia, and we've been talking about academia in this, there is inherently within the way that it's structured within the reward systems and in the measurement systems and metrics, this bias against this field, because take what allows you to publish in a high impact journal. You usually require some sort of statistical power within your research. There are standard criteria that you need. This, of course, is not reachable here because usually you have as small as a sample size of 1 or n equals 1, which there is no homogeneity, there is no statistical significance in the research that you do. That means then that causes you not to receive tenure. Research funding is dependent upon it. And so there is an inherent bias against research in this area. But I think your point is very well made. We're trying to affect a culture change within a complex system. And so we need to not only introduce something new, but we need to change the whole system because it won't survive. It does require a very, very fundamental rethinking of many of the assumptions of academia, of design, of marketing, of of decision-making, of planning, etc. And so anywhere where those nested systems are not also changed, there's a friction point. And the change that you've tried to effect erodes and doesn't survive. So researchers in this area, individuals that practice this, are also experiencing those impacts of the mismatch between this method and the current strategies, assumptions, processes that are out there.
Thank
but
you.
It has such, I mean, the other side of it, I don't want to be sort of give you only the negative. If what we know of inclusive design is that it also addresses some of the major issues that we have in planning and the crises that we are in at the moment. So you were talking about this realization that this is important. The interesting individuals that are looking to our methodologies include people like cybersecurity, the health rollout. We are recognizing that none of us are safe until all of us are safe. Sustainability is something that can be addressed through this. Many of the climate scientists are moving in this direction. So it's not just the individuals that are in the field that are recognizing the importance of this, or companies, but anyone that is trying to deal with crises. People at that outer edge are the best stress testers. They are the people that are most vulnerable to the effects of crises to come, and therefore they are also the canaries, act as the canaries in the coal mine of what is going to go wrong. So we definitely need to design with those individuals that are not served by our current methods of research, design, etc. But yes, within the academy or within a company, within an organization, the inclusive designers are also experiencing some of these mismatches.
Thanks so much, Yuta. And I know we only have a few more minutes. Sam or Damian, would you like to add?
Yeah,
just
my hand is up. Okay. Damian,
ahead,
yes,
Sam.
please. No, please, go ahead.
Okay, no, I was just going to say, just on our experience on I suppose, accrediting engineering programs, one of the elements there, for example, is ethics. And the one thing we have learned from going to the various universities and the way it's taught, you cannot have ethics 101. It doesn't work just having a module, because the students will learn it, tick a box and move on. You've got to spread it across all the modules and all the concepts and everything that's done. And I think inclusive design falls into the same category. You can't just have a module on inclusive design. I think it needs to be spread holistically across the entire program. And maybe the first challenge for inclusive design is to design a way of delivering it, if that's not too recursive.
Brilliant. Thanks, Damian. Sorry, Sam, I didn't see your hand. So you get the last word, Sambari.
Okay, just a couple of sentences, maybe I'll speak. My point is that we need to make conversations around inclusion a part of the dominant discourse among engineers. Like, engineers are focused on technology, right? The idea is to drive home that it takes two to tango, like the user and the tech. And we need to turn the focus of the engineers on the user. And again, there's another point, like, while accessibility focuses on disability, and it's hard to develop empathy for disability without actually experiencing it oneself or in one's loved ones, inclusive design encompasses more elements of diversity, such as gender, age, nationality, culture, race, which is more easily visible and possible to develop empathy for. Like I said earlier, the only thing we need to do is to help engineers develop empathy. They don't need our help for anything else. They are good to do their job. That's it.
Thank you, Sam. And it falls to me to wrap up. It's been a fantastic session. I see that there are lots and lots of questions in the Q&A, and they are recorded. And I know that our speakers are happy to follow up with individual participants afterwards as well. So it just leaves it with me to say thank you so much to three excellent speakers, all of you. Thanks to Donal and Alex and Claire and Aoife and Michelle in the captioning unit. Thank you very much to the EGA for the opportunity to speak about our favorite subject, and we'd love to come back and work with you on it. Thank you to all the corporate sponsors, College of Engineering and Architecture, and thank you to all our participants for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks very much, everyone.